I was scrolling through the comments section of my HDRP Raindrop shader tutorial when this comment caught my eye.
Can you make a tutorial to do this in URP?
To which I replied, "Grrr." As it turns out, there are a few things going on with Martin's original shader, but to cut a long story short, it was built in the built-in rendering pipeline, and not URP. Apparently, Unity removed grab passes in URP because of performance issues, but in the interest of ruining frame rates across the globe, I thought I'd hack one back in. The Universal Render Pipeline was originally called the Pissweek Render Pipeline, and for good reason. So this is essentially a disclaimer that the following solution is certainly not the sort of thing you would introduce to your parents because it's a little on the slow side, but boy does it look pretty. It also saves you from having to write your own custom texture sampler or render pass. So let's get stuck into it. The first thing we need to do is a bit of housekeeping. Start or open a URP project, open whatever scene you want to work in, and select the main camera. Turn opaque texture on as best you can. Duplicate the camera, rename it to RenderCam, change the tag from main camera to none, remove the second audio listener from it, untick post-processing, and set it as a child of the main camera. Also make sure in your rendering settings that opaque texture is ticked. There might be several other places to check, but it changes so often you will have to check with whatever Unity version you're using. If you are starting a new URP project, make it look pretty and create a quad for the window. I'd recommend scaling it into a rectangle so you can keep an eye out for UV distortions. Instead of rebuilding the whole Raindrop shader again from scratch, head to the TCG GitHub repo and download the HDRP version. If you want to know more about it, you can watch the HDRP tut and give the like button a bit of a tickle whilst you're there. Copy the shader folder into your project and open up the shader graph. In the active target settings, remove the HDRP reference and replace it with Universal. Set the material to transparent and tick alpha clipping in case you want irregular shaped windows in your project. Remove the HDRP scene color node since we aren't in a high definition render pipeline, more's the pity, and hook up a regular scene color node. Save it and apply the material to your window. You should see raindrops, but the blur thingy is completely fuckoed. You may have noticed that the scene color node in the shader graph doesn't have a LOD input, which is where the blur comes from. So the question is, how do we get mipmap sampling to work in URP now that Unity has removed access to it? And the answer is not easily. Basically, we need to find where the fragment shader is up to in the UV, sample the surrounding pixels, and average out the current fragment value using the LOD out of the custom function node as a mask. Or we can just stuff a scene camera buffer into a render texture, then stuff that into the shader like some sort of rendering turducken. This is essentially what a grab pass did, or does anyway, except that it didn't require camera stacking. Why Unity insists on removing features that work perfectly fine is, first we need to make a render texture and set it to the rendering target of the rendering turducken cam. Next we need to cull the window from its rendering queue by setting the object to a custom layer called something like render exempt, then removing that layer from the culling mask. We need to add a texture 2D property to the shader graph for the render texture. Create a sample texture 2D LOD node and connect the render texture, LOD and UV up, and delete the scene color node. Connect the sample texture node up to the base color thingy, and before I forget, you might want to create a sample state set to repeat and trilinear and hook that up to the sample texture 2D node's sample state port, just to force it into trilinear sampling since it gives the smoothest blurring. Save it and head back to your scene. Drag the render texture onto the raindrop material, which should also already be applied to the quad in case you missed that part. It's going to look a bit scuffed in the scene editor because of the camera stacking, so don't worry about it. The blur setting is still cooked though because I forgot to enable auto mip maps on the render texture, so ticking that is probably a good idea. You should probably also tick dynamic scaling because it sounds important, and change the filter mode to trilinear. The blurring works, but the projected perspective of the turducken cam is also fuckoed because the render texture aspect ratio, not the size, must match your screen aspect ratio. So long as the aspect ratios match, you can render the texture at any resolution you want. Just remember that the higher the resolution, the more stress it puts on the blah 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 blah. Head to the game view to see if everything is working correctly. If it still looks a bit wonky, the last thing you can try is to set the turducken cam's priority to 0 so that it's not competing with the main camera for screen real estate. And with that, the work is done. I've included a normal map refraction effect for shits and giggles, but it's not tiled and I'm not going to go over it here. There's still plenty of stuff you could do, but I'm bored, so thanks for watching.